Welcome to our session of the Humanities Symposium. My name is Kim Munez, and I teach the senior seminar to modern language majors. And these are some of the students who were in the class last fall. I'm joined today with a panel of students who have studied in different areas off campus. And since our majors focus off campus, and they spend several months of their college career abroad, the senior seminar becomes a place where we all reflect on our experiences and on all that we have observed while abroad. It's the one and only time in our major that students from the different areas in our department have the opportunity to get together and discuss issues that cut across the languages. It's a place where students can share their disparate experiences with peers who are sympathetic listeners and fellow travelers on the road to fluency in another language. So thank you for coming today to listen to these individuals and about what they were able to learn as they studied abroad. When I first mentioned the possibility about writing a paper on the topic of wealth, they said, well, we aren't economists. We don't think we can do this. And some of them even sent me emails saying why they couldn't do it. And it really took starting to read some of the books that you see projected up here. These were the 3 books that were the common textbooks of the senior seminar, until we started to have kind of an idea of how we might approach this. And I need to give a shout out to Crystal Downing, my wonderful colleague and teacher of many here, for her book, How Postmodernism Serves My Faith. And because of that book, all language majors are graduating from Messiah College with a postmodern awareness that everyone's search for truth has certain philosophical underpinnings, which in turn are shaped by the currents of thought of a particular time and place. So my students never stop talking about the towers of discourse that envelop them, and some of them even brought construction paper towers with words to illustrate that particular chapter from your book. Once this group understood the notion of wealth as a human construct that manifests itself in particular ways in different cultures, they found that they had something to say, because they had observed many things while living in other environments. The reflections you will hear today are based on these observations that our panelists brought back with them from Chile, France, Germany, Spain, the Philadelphia campus, and in the future we'll have Chinese studies majors speaking about China as well. We just don't have anybody who is a senior yet in that major. Today, you'll hear from Jackie Kiefer, I'll give a little wave, about the cost of higher education, which is a concern of students in the United States and Spain. Keith Parada will speak about the cultural constructs of wealth in France. Sarah Polonis will tell you about what is motivating student protest movements in Chile. Rachel Bjorkman will address the topic of residential segregation in Chile. And Amanda Russell, who spent a semester studying in Germany and also visited the Vatican, will be addressing the topic of wealth and the Vatican. Gemma Brady and I are serving as moderators of this session that focuses on the intercultural explorations of wealth. So Gemma?
Again, I am Gemma Brady. I am a Spanish major with a K-12 teaching certification, and I studied at the Philadelphia campus. As students, most of us start college having just come off of a successful high school career, being fairly confident and almost full of ourselves. Then we meet people who come from backgrounds that are profoundly different from our own, and we are able to see things that have not been apparent to us before. When we study abroad or off campus domestically, like at our Philadelphia campus at Temple, we expect to learn about another culture, but we don't expect to learn so much about ourselves. Part of the college experience is to begin to understand those differences and to recognize that the college experience itself is a privilege. And how must this look to a person on the outside that's referring to the college experience? Franklin and I did not get off to the best start. He asked me for money while I was on my way back from class, and I honestly didn't have any cash on me. He screamed obscenities at me because I was lying, and anybody who could pay tuition for school must have some money on them. As a compromise, I offered to take him to McDonald's for lunch using my diamond dollars. He accepted rather disgruntledly. From then on, I saw Franklin fairly regularly. We talked about anything and everything, the most interesting of which was Franklin's past and how he lived his everyday life. He had been through several halfway house type programs, but he said that there was not enough support for him after he left, and that he ate better as a homeless person than he did making minimum wage. And living near Temple's campus, Franklin is constantly reminded of how much supposedly poor college students have, walking to class with their earbuds in, talking on their iPhones, and whining about the research paper that's due Tuesday, wearing their North Face jackets, leggings, and Uggs. Franklin sees this as quite the opposite of poor because all of our basic needs are provided for, and on top of that, we have the privilege of dedicating 4 years of our lives to learning in a specialized field. Franklin helped me to see that what I look like from the perspective of someone on the outside. He saw me as someone with access to the richness of the college experience. He helped me to see that experience for all it's worth. But that doesn't mean that everyone on the inside is without their hardships and struggles. And I will now turn things over to Jackie Kiefer, who found out when she studied in Spain that concerns about the affordability of higher education are not unique to American students and their families.
Okay, so when investigating higher education in the United States, it's evident that individuals with a low socioeconomic status are underrepresented. After studying abroad in Barcelona, I became aware of the significantly low cost of higher education in Spain. I desired to know if socioeconomic statuses were more equally represented in higher education in Spain than in the United States. My purpose is to reflect on the exclusion of the lower class from higher education in the United States and compare our situation to that of Spain.
I'm afraid your voice might not carry. Thank you.
Okay. I will address various implications this has on individuals of a lower class and our society as a whole. As previously mentioned, the cost of tuition in the United States is significantly greater than the cost of tuition in Spain. The average cost of public tuition in the United States is $15,918 per year. On the other hand, enrollment fees for bachelor's degrees at public universities in Spain vary between 500 and 1,120 euros per academic year. When examining these facts, one would hypothesize that people of a lower socioeconomic status are probably underrepresented in higher education in the United States and more equally represented in Spain. Evidence exists supporting the former, but the latter claim has not been universally undisputed. Individuals from families of a lower income are underrepresented in higher education in the United States. Findings from the U.S. Census Bureau show that students from families in the highest income quartile participate in college at nearly a 90% rate, while those from the bottom quartile participate at a less than 60% rate. This statistic shows a large correlation between college attendance and socioeconomic status. Exorbitant tuition costs definitely contribute to the underrepresentation of the lower class to an extent. Jean Nicol claims that the crescendo of rising costs and expenditures cannot be thought acceptable. It fences out a huge segment of our community on the basis of wealth. Education is a public good that should be equally available to all, but when it comes with such a large price tag, equality is difficult to reach. Because of Spain's generally low tuition costs, less of the lower class has been excluded from higher education. But in spite of the drastically lower costs, the representation of classes in higher education has not yet reached equality. Even though universities reserved for the elite have disappeared, socioeconomic variables heavily influence the demand for university education, So the equality of opportunities in this educational level has not been completely achieved. There has definitely been an improvement in access to higher education in Spain, but slight inequality still persists in the system. Jose Gines Mora found that approximately 30% of the population with fewer economic resources is underrepresented in Spanish higher education. Since a fairly small percentage of low-class individuals are underrepresented, this statistic shows that Spanish people from lower classes have a greater opportunity to gain access to higher education than people from the United States. Mora emphasized that in Spain, the distribution of higher education is relatively uniform. While Spain's tuition costs have made access to higher education more feasible for people of a low socioeconomic status, they continue to be unequally represented in the university. Clearly, a lack of adequate funds is not the sole reason for these findings and statistics, both in the United States and in Spain, but it is evident that the problem of wealth plays a part. Underrepresentation of people from a low socioeconomic status is a significant issue because of its cyclic nature and the effect it has on our society at large. Education and access to wealth often go hand in hand. Many times, low-class individuals do not pursue higher education because they fear they would not have the funds to pay for it. Because of this, these individuals are excluded from our society and do not have the opportunity to flourish through higher education. In addition, it is clear that the premium associated with educational attainment has grown significantly over time. Ultimately, it may be difficult for these citizens to have an equal access to wealth because of their lack of education. But the premium that comes from higher education is more than just material wealth. Higher education not only helps individuals have better access to material wealth, it also provides a different type of wealth, human wealth. This relates to Eagleton's idea of flourishing that I previously mentioned. Oftentimes, society believes that being human does not require effort and comes automatically. Eagleton reflects on Aristotle's belief that being human was something you had to get good at through constant practice. This is where the idea of human wealth comes into play. For example, studying the humanities is a fundamental component of acquiring this type of wealth. The humanities give students the opportunity to see situations from different perspectives and helps us to understand the system of which we are a part. In today's world, it is difficult to see the benefit of studying subjects such as literature and history because they have no obvious material payoff. Eagleton argues that art and literature raise questions of the quality of life in a world where experience itself seems brittle and degraded. Studying these topics helps develop the skills people need to critically evaluate our world today and come up with creative answers to these important questions. Currently, we seem to have achieved affluence without fulfillment. In order to flourish in life, a healthy combination of material wealth and human wealth is necessary. This combination is difficult to achieve without investing in higher education. Because of the underrepresentation of lower income students from higher education, these students not only have less access to material wealth, they also have less access to human wealth. At first glance, it may seem as though the solution to this problem is simply to lower the cost of higher education. Then, low-class individuals will be more likely to afford an education and be given a fair chance to access material and human wealth. But undoubtedly, this quick-fix attempt would not really solve the problem. Looking at Spain's system of higher education as an example, it is clear that low tuition costs do not completely resolve the underrepresentation issue. Spain's lower class is still underrepresented with a considerably lower tuition cost than that of the United States. If lowering the tuition rates will not solve the problem, we need to objectively examine the issue at hand more deeply in hopes of understanding the actual problem and begin the process of change so that individuals will have access to not only material wealth, but more importantly, human wealth.
As humanists, we can examine human history and see who has access to the wealth. In the beginning, God created a life-sustaining, all-bountiful garden. According to Genesis chapter 2, the river that passed through the garden split into 4 tributaries, and there was gold and onyx in the land. A mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. There was no scarcity in the garden. Terry Eagleton, one of our authors, and also a preeminent cultural theorist of our time, has pointed out that in primitive societies, little or no surplus is generated, so everyone has to work and nobody can live off of the toil of others. Some societies develop the capacities and technical know-how to produce a sizable economic surplus. Although these societies are capable of organizing material production in a way that benefits all, it seems that the more common pattern of behavior throughout human history has been to hoard and store. What Jesus has to say about this is recorded in Luke 12. The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully, and he thought within himself, saying, "What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops?" So he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build the greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things that he possesses." This was a lesson that was lost on King Nebuchadnezzar, who was walking about the royal palace of Babylon saying, "Is this not great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty?" While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you. They shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field." Daniel 4.
During my time in Strasbourg, France, I noticed that there was more of a sense of refinement to the French concept of wealth than I was used to. Versailles is perhaps the best known symbol of French opulence, but it is also a reminder of what can happen when the wealth of a nation is concentrated in one place. So let's situate ourselves in the time of the French Revolution during the time of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Try to picture the stark contrast between the lavish lifestyle of the king and queen compared to the peasants of France, who were starving due to one of the worst bread shortages France has ever seen. It's not hard to imagine that the common people held extremely negative views of the French monarchs and their court. These feelings eventually culminated during the French Revolution, when the citizens executed both King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette. Such unfortunate results come about when a system creates exorbitant affluence, alongside what Terry Eagleton referred to as huge swatches of deprivation. In other words, the greater the inequality, the stronger the reaction. I think it is important to note that the passionate kind of violence that was seen during the French Revolution could be due to the vast difference between the upper-class bourgeoisie and the starving peasant class. The violence that took place during the Revolution was very much a kind of revenge against the monarchy that was completely ignorant to the people who were literally starving on the streets. Now let's fast forward to modern-day France. With the monarchy long gone, and the surviving royal families still afraid of living in France, the scene has changed quite a bit. When we think of the French in terms of modern conception of wealth, we may think of the Coco Chanel type characters. These are the women with long legs and fancy dresses that wear diamond necklaces and smoke expensive cigarettes and wear expensive perfume. This is a fairly accurate picture of France's point of view as well. For them, the idea of wealth means hosting frequent dinner parties, skiing in the Alps, having numerous houses in the country, and not having to be careful about consuming resources such as gasoline, electricity, water, etc. First and foremost for the French, the idea of wealth and luxury is extremely seductive. The French take extreme pride in the luxury items they produce and export all over the world. Some of the finest perfume, high fashion, including clothes, bags, shoes, haute cuisine, jewelry, and of course wine, are all major exports of France. You can take a walk down the Champs-Élysées and see some of the finest and most expensive luxury items in the world. This has been the case for so long that it is ingrained in our mind that French products are high quality. In fact, other countries and manufacturers are trying to mimic and profit from the French model as well. If you go to almost any place cheaper clothes are sold, think of Old Navy or Forever 21, it's entirely not uncommon to see clothes with random French words stitched into the clothing. Even if the article has nothing to do with French or the French language. Manufacturers are relying on the subconscious link to try and trick you into thinking you're actually buying a higher quality item. So next time you go shopping, mainly for the ladies, be on the lookout for cliche French words and phrases like bonjour, je t'aime, Paris, and of course, l'amour. Of course, that obviously wouldn't fly in France. The French themselves seem to have an altogether older idea of wealth than the average American. In France, the national idea of classic wealth goes all the way back to figures like Marie Antoinette, rather than the American idea of wealth, which is more like Paris Hilton or the Kardashians. As we discussed, there is a huge difference in the cultural perspectives of wealth between France and the United States. If we take the seemingly endless stream of advertisements we watch, it's easy to see that we are being taught that wealth buys happiness, or even that wealth is power. We tell our children to work hard in school, hoping that they will get good jobs that will earn them a lot of money, which in turn ensure their happiness. For the French, the idea of wealth immediately conjures up the ideas of seduction in their heads. The idea of dressing up in expensive clothes, drinking finely crafted wine, hosting dinner parties with their friends with the good china, are dangerously close to irresistible. This is the idea that would push them towards wanting wealth above more American motivators like power.
How did I first become aware of the fact that some people had more money than others? I remember the first time in elementary school that I noticed one of my friends had a ticket of a different color for lunch. I didn't know what it meant. I just knew that hers was purple and mine was yellow. It wasn't until much later, probably high school, that I figured out what that ticket meant. My friend was a part of the free and reduced lunch program at our school. She had lived on a farm for her entire life and had 3 younger siblings. It had never occurred to me that her family couldn't afford to pay for food or needed assistance. I knew that many of my classmates teased her for being different, but I didn't understand until much later the stigma associated with the reduced lunch program. I now see the cruelty in such teasing, and how through no fault of her own my friend was made to feel inferior. When Jesus was on earth, they mocked him too, saying, "Doctor, heal yourself." And when he was on the cross, he responded, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Before arriving to Chile, I had never given much consideration to the topic of wealth and what its real-life implications are. Although I admit that I'm still partially ignorant to these realities, my experiences studying in Chile allowed me to expand my views on wealth. As a student enrolled in a public university, I first-handedly saw the education crisis and the effects it has on Chilean society. Compiling what I learned in Chile and what I already know about the American education system, and comparing this to the ideas of authors like Eagleton and Downing, I now feel that I have a much broader perspective on wealth, how it's used, and how this information helps me fit into the world as an educated global citizen. As I previously mentioned, before my time spent abroad, I was completely shaped by the cultural constructions of discourse which surrounded me. As Crystal Downing explains in her book, How Postmodernism Serves My Faith, which we read in our seminar, each person is a product of the elements of culture in which they live. These discourses of culture surround each person and give them a background for their thoughts and beliefs. As Downing explains in her book, These statements mold your existence. They are the truths that give shape to your childhood reality. Neither you nor your parents made the statements up. What is written on the construction paper walls reflects the values of their cultural affiliations. Downing then goes to explain that until one notices conflict or confronts another culture, these notions within each person's discourse are viewed as absolute truth. I can relate to this idea being culturally constructed and in a sense blinded, because before I went to Chile, I firstly did not realize that receiving a decent quality education in the United States was fairly easy relative to other countries, and second of all, I didn't realize that the Chilean system was so heavily based on capitalistic ideology. While I was there, however, I went through a process of deconstruction which allowed me to adapt to the culture. At first, I didn't understand why the education system was unfair to the lower classes. However, through a process of breaking down my pre-existent barriers that had shaped my biases, through conversation, literature, my Chilean family, etc., I was able to gain a more personalized understanding of how the system is different and why it hurts the poor and caters to the rich. These ideas that I've gained are now a part of me and my outlook, which in turn now affect the way I think and the way I perceive new ideas. Currently in Chile, there are huge problems with the education system. The relationship between the public and private schools in Chile is very different than that of the United States and is one of the country's biggest social and governmental issues. The problems began during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, who was Chile's harshly violent rightist president from 1973 until 1998. He significantly reduced the government's involvement in the public school system in an effort to reverse Marxist reforms made by Salvador Allende, Chile's prior president. After the dictatorship, little was done to rebalance the fund allocation. In 2006, large-scale student protests began out of immediate concern for the high cost to take the standardized university admissions test, which is similar to America's SAT, and the public transportation fees to travel to and from school. However, longer-term concerns included lack of government loans offered, as well as the generally low amount of federal government participation, funding, and regulation in the system. Students recognize that because of lack of funding in the public sector, most of the elementary and high schools have been privatized. These new private schools are more expensive to attend because they aren't government funded and can be compared to the United States version of Catholic schools in that they provide a quality education but require a tuition. One problem, however, with both the Catholic school model and the Chilean private system is there exists the tendency to view students more as clients coming to their business rather than students with a right to learn. Due to the staggeringly high tuition expenses that a Chilean citizen must pay to receive quality elementary, secondary, and higher education, little of high quality is made accessible to those who are not born into families of the wealthy class. Statistics show that the majority of students who pass the college entrance test went to private schools, which means that students with more money are more likely to get a college education, and those who can't afford a quality elementary and high school education won't. This serves to perpetuate the overwhelming gap between the rich and the poor. There are only about 25 public universities remaining in Chile, and the rest have been privatized and the tuition fees have been raised. Compared to American universities, Chilean tuitions are exponentially higher based on salaries of an average family. For example, average monthly minimum wage in Chile is $385 US, while the average monthly college tuition equates to $485 US. As you can see, compared to what they make, they pay a much higher percentage in tuition. In addition, government-subsidized loans are much less frequent, which forces families to essentially pay for everything up front, keeping in mind that if you went to a public high school, the chance of you even being accepted into a college is very slim. All of this said, it is extremely difficult for students who have not been born into high-class families to receive a proper high-quality education. The student protest movement is now led by 24-year-old Camila Vallejo, who is a member of the Chilean Communist Youth, president of both the University of Chile Student Federation and the Confederation of Chilean Students. She rallies mass groups of students to participate in protests, strikes, and demonstrations, and is demanding more direct federal participation in the secondary education system, a waive on the university entrance exam fee, free public transportation for students to and from school, and an end to the higher education profit-making. Growing discontent over the lack of concrete reform has prompted thousands of university students and hundreds of less organized high school students to follow her footsteps in disrupting the current school system through takeovers. Needless to say, they finally got a response from the state in the form of water cannons and tear gas. Dramatic clashes like this one have taken place over the course of the past 8 years. Before spending 5 months abroad, studying the topic of education and even attending student protests in local plazas, I never would have realized that a topic such as education would cause such complex nationwide issues. I can now see that a leader like Vallejo, who has taken a drastic stand against the government's education system, is the type of radical leader that Terry Eagleton refers to in his book After Theory, when he states, "Radicals would rather not be the way they are. They regard themselves as holding awkward, mildly freakish opinions forced upon them by the current condition of the species, and yearn secretly to be normal. Or rather, they look forward to a future in which they would no longer be saddled with such inconvenient beliefs, since they would have been realized in practice. They would then be free to join the human race." Vallejo is a young, wealthy leader who does not need free education to be successful because she has been blessed with high social status. However, her necessity to advocate for the oppressed is an opinion forced on her by current conditions despite its inconveniences. Like Eagleton, she desires reforms that will result in abundance for everyone so that everyone can live comfortably. The problem is that as long as the rich exist, the poor cannot live abundantly, and as long as the poor exist, the rich cannot live provisionally. They will need to watch constantly their backs, and Eagleton said that. Radicals such as Vallejo and Eagleton seek change and restructure because they have seen the deficiencies of the current systems. In this case, Vallejo has seen the education system's negative effects on society and envisions a reformed system with more government participation and funding because she sees the outcome would benefit everyone. Chile is not a backward nation, and despite the generation of substantial economic resources over the past decade and a half, there is still significant inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor remains an intractable problem despite the country's macroeconomic successes. The wealthiest 10% of Chileans receive 47% of all income. By contrast, the lowest 10% earned only 1.2% of total income. The income ratio of the highest to lowest 10% is roughly 41-1. These numbers clearly display the pressing need for a more equitable distribution of wealth in Chile. Eagleton weighs in on the wealth gap with this thought-provoking statement. The rich have no future because they have too much present, whereas the poor have no future because they have too little present. If the Chilean system were less structured around capitalistic opportunity, perhaps we would begin to see a more even distribution of wealth, which would give more future to everyone. Through my experiences in Chile and my related research, I agree with Vallejo and Eagleton in regards to these statistics that the ideal combination would be to live with a sufficiency of goods but be prepared to give them up. This reality would allow for a more evenly distributed wealth between the rich and the poor, cause less of a reliance on materialistic goods with which to provide a future, and more specifically allow students to receive the quality schooling that is necessary to produce further generations of educated world leaders. Thank you.
Kind of following on what Sarah was saying, this past May, as part of a cross-cultural trip to Spain, Dr. Dos and I took a group of Messiah students to the small mountainous town of Mondragon in the Basque region. There we saw a model of business in which the CEOs and the CFOs earn no more than 7 times the wage of the highest paid workers. The particular business that we toured produces major appliances that are sold throughout the European Union, and it could be compared with GE. The model we have grown accustomed to in the last decades is that of a CEO or a CFO that earns up to 300 times the wage of the highest paid workers. The members of the appliance corporation that we toured had recently voted to cut their own wages in response to the economic crisis in order to keep the jobs in the Basque region, as opposed to farming jobs out to areas of the world where the only resource in abundance is cheap human labor. The Mondragon Cooperative has found a way to generate wealth and keep it in the community. I'm not an economist, but I am a humanist, and I can see the merit of such models, as do other critical thinkers who are in the humanist tradition. The system, says Terry Eagleton, breeds freedom as well as barbarism, emancipation along with enslavement. Capitalist society generates enormous wealth, but in a way that cannot help putting it beyond the reach of most of its citizens. Even so, that wealth can always be brought within reach. It can be disentangled from the acquisitive individualist form which bred it, invested in the community as a whole, and used to keep disagreeable work to a minimum. It can thus release men and women from the chains of economic necessity into a life where they are free to realize their creative potential. Rachel?
We paged the Jumbo magazine in the first grade English elective class, looking at deals for the week in the supermarket. Fernanda's big brown eyes looked longingly at the food. Each page she simply said, "Yum." As we continued paging, she stopped at the alcohol. She looked up at me with her big brown eyes and simply said, "That's only for men." During recess, children would receive the only food for their day, typically consisting of fried dough and avocado, and government-issued chips, cheese sticks, and yogurt. The small children ran around in state-issued uniforms and big, baggy winter coats that were a few sizes too big. Builders of the Future, also called Thieves of the Future by neighboring towns, is a school which caters to the needs of 5 group homes within the satellite neighborhood of La Pintana in Santiago, Chile. This small school within the premises of La Pintana is a prime example of the residential segregation occurring in Chile. 75 miles to the west, the Pacific Ocean glimmers alongside the cities of Viña del Mar and Valparaiso. While there are still some group homes and poor living in the city, they are hidden in the small valleys and on the ridges of the seaside coastal mountains. The residential segregation is hidden beneath the radar, a result of the uneven distribution of wealth within the social classes and the inability to allocate sufficient resources to the lower classes. The Chilean housing policy was created in 1906 and is the foundation for many of the problems that have become prevalent in society. Chile became the first country in the Americas to sanction a national law about housing and the first country in Latin America to reduce the housing deficit. Throughout a period of about 50 years, many changes took place within the Chilean housing market, regarding who controls it and who may legally occupy the land. The biggest turn of events within Chilean society and the housing industry occurred during the time of Salvador Allende's term in office, where he instituted that housing was not a commodity, but a right that has to be provided by the state. However, the private sector denied Allende's proposed changes to the Chilean housing policies and ultimately stopped any housing development within the nation. In 1979, the city limits of Santiago were dismantled by the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, and developers acquired massive amounts of land throughout the surrounding Chilean Central Valley. This private sector started operating primarily in the urban lands. After the dictatorship, during the late 80s and early 90s, the Chilean housing policy began to focus more intentionally on housing for the very poor. The housing policy began to focus on subsidizing housing for low and middle income families because the poor are more dependent on the government and public housing programs. However, these subsidies for housing have manifested themselves in a form of urban segregation, which restricts opportunities for Chileans to receive quality education, recreation, and places of employment. The poor are still overcrowded, and the houses delivered by the state, basic units and progressive units, are showing quality problems. The Chilean housing crisis manifests itself into present-day Chile, where the city of Santiago is essentially split in half. The northeastern part of the city consists of the rich elite, who do not cross the invisible boundary set in place by the famous Plaza de Armas. Across the invisible boundary lies the rest of the people in Santiago in residentially segregated and less affluent communities. My Chilean culture and conversation professor, Carlos Caceres, always sarcastically said, "Oh, the life of an international student, it's so rough. Students live with families in safe neighborhoods, go to class, and hop on a plane to travel throughout South America on the weekends. My family seemed like any other family in the United States or abroad. My siblings went to parties, spent time on Facebook, went shopping with their friends. My host mom was divorced, and the children lived with their mother and saw their father on the weekends. They attended a private German school and a technical school, played on organized sports teams, and had a weekly allowance. The family was extremely loving and spent a lot of time together, often going places with one another. The stark contrast between the rich and the poor is practically unnoticeable in the middle-class neighborhood where I live, while studying with international studies abroad. There are certain sections that the study abroad staff and host family said were unsafe to go at certain times. Most of the neighborhoods in Viña and Valparaiso were accessible and safe to walk in throughout the day. There are no blatant signs of poverty or segregation. If you fast forward a few months to my internship in La Pintana, a neighborhood on the outskirts of Santiago de Chile. The morning I landed in Chile, the car took me the opposite way from Viña del Mar and Valparaiso. 25 minutes later, we entered a high-security gated compound in the middle of La Pintana. The differences were astronomical, and as though I was living in a different country. Driving through La Pintana during the daylight, I thought to myself, I can't possibly be Chile right now, can I? The kids interviewed for my internship questionnaires had the same dreams as the students in Viña del Mar and Valparaiso, but were unable to attain them. Denise, a 13-year-old girl, was pregnant when I first arrived at school, but lost the baby after supposedly falling down a flight of stairs. My 7th graders drew on the walls with their own blood and talked about the pimps down the street who would bribe them with money for sexual favors. The parents worked in buses, drug or prostitution rings, or were completely absent from the lives of the children who had become property of the state. According to statistics, the likelihood that the kids will graduate from high school is around 10%. In all reality, the residential segregation is almost a guarantee that these children will never be able to break out from the cycle of poverty that their birth and status in society has placed them in. As Terry Eagleton makes it clear in his book After Theory, the rich have mobility while the poor have locality, or rather, the poor have locality until the rich get their hands on it. The locality and neighborhood I experienced had little influence from the poor, but instead could be considered a middle-class neighborhood. The middle-class residents with mobility could hop on a bus to Coquimbo or Santiago, while the children I spent 7 weeks with at Builders of the Future had never left their neighborhood, let alone their town or city. It is often difficult to see problems in our own culture. In the United States, it took us centuries to acknowledge and work out racial inequality and segregation. In Chile, where there is little racial diversity, inequality is primarily manifested through residential segregation, as I illustrated in the contrast between the coastal Viña del Mar and the urban projects like La Pintana. Each nation brings its unique set of problems. How can the cycle of poverty be broken? From cradle to grave, the whole system depends on the amount of money an individual's family has. Neighborhoods are determined by the strict borders and gates placed around them. A poor family will never see beyond the outside of the barred gates. The students at Builders of the Future ultimately have no future outside the reality that their parents are living in on a day-to-day basis. It is beyond the scope of this paper to explain how this wealth gap came about, but as Eagleton says, when looking to the future, there is no other place to start than the present moment. In Chile, the present moment is marked by a divide between affluence and spectacular poverty.
And the neighborhood that Rachel went to, there's a mission that's working with that neighborhood, and they really love Rachel. So they said if any other Messiah students are interested in working with these children in Builders of the Future, you can speak with Rachel about that. I also have the contact information for that church group. So the haunting question is, if our world can produce adequate resources to feed everyone, why then do so many people live in conditions of scarcity, forced to rumble for a piece of pie or to not eat at all?
So this is the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. And when I took my pilgrimage there, as I walked inside, I was truly amazed by what I saw. Their gold-covered ceilings, the intricate designs, the marble sculptures, and the famous paintings. I would walk around and I would fall to my knees and I would start crying. I had a very different reaction than most people did. A lot of people walked around, run in front of something, do a weird face and take a picture of themselves in front of those things, those items. And I couldn't understand why they were doing that. For me, each time that I was before something, tears were streaming down my face, and I would be pulled deeper into my hunger for the Lord. And so my question came to be, is this not what the church should be? And so, however, not everyone has that same experience like I did. They don't think about those questions. But maybe you're like some of those people and they're going to walk into a basilica like this and ask the question, why is there all this gold? Where did they get this money from? That doesn't make any sense. And what's the point of spending all this money on a church building when we could be giving it outwards? But when I took a tour of the treasury and they were explaining what was going on, I learned at that point that most of the things that are brought into the church for the designs are actually donations that were given from the rich. The church didn't take any money in from the people and use that to create a decoration or to create the gold ceilings and things like that was given to them. And it's something that we don't often think about or don't recognize. So in my paper, I hope to explore these questions in the light of the transition from how the church got into trouble with money, with the idea of indulgences, and incorporating wealth into that idea of salvation, to how the church now incorporates wealth in the idea of serving the poor and the desolate. So let's just go back to the beginning, back to the 1600s, and this is where the church ran into some issues with indulgences. So the doctrine of indulgences is closely linked to purgatory because it was and is believed that some of the guilt remaining after sin has been forgiven can be remitted by penitential practices. So the Catholic Church does believe that everyone will eventually go to purgatory in order to be fully cleansed by a refining fire before we can enter the kingdom of God. Who would want to walk into paradise being sinful and dirty with everything that we still have on us? It makes sense. Personally, I would not want to go just as I am. So the idea of indulgences at first wasn't a bad thing. It kind of made sense, but what happened is it kind of got wrong because people started paying to kind of postpone their time in purgatory. So they were asked to do good works and things like that. So I can't really see how doing good things on earth could change anything, but I can see how that fear of purgatory, that fear of that refining fire, would make this such a viable option. So those who were brought into indulgences were doing good things, but for the wrong reason. So my question became, is there really any true good being done, which Jesus called his people to? So then after the indulgences came, we moved into the time of Crusades, which was something so much more than it was supposed to be. So then the view of indulgences then changed a little bit and became known as a Plenary Indulgence, which is simply an indulgence which remitted all the guilt remaining for sins committed, thus seeming to guarantee immediate entrance into heaven at death. So one can easily see how this gave the church a terrible reputation for the dealings with wealth. How could anyone trust a church that is covered in gold after a past like this? Or how can anyone believe that anything changed? But she has changed, and that's the point. So even with a past like the Catholic Church has, we have to be able to let go and to move on. We need to be inspired to live a better life, to live as Christ calls us to. Outside of a horrifying history, the Catholic Church offers us an example of how to live through the lives of saints who did not fall into her failures. Terry Eagleton mentions an after theory, that those who speak up for justice will be done away with by the state. And I believe this statement refers to many of the lives of the saints who died through martyrdom. St. Lawrence of Rome, who's right here, was killed after his view on the wealth of church. And I'm just going to share his story with you. So as a deacon in Rome, Lawrence was charged with the responsibility for the material goods of the church and the distribution of alms to the poor. When Lawrence knew he was to be arrested like the Pope, he sought out the poor, widows, and orphans of Rome and gave them all the money he had on hand, selling even the sacred vessels to increase the sum. When the prefect of Rome had heard this, he imagined that the Christians must have had considerable treasures. He sent for Lawrence, and Lawrence replied that the church was indeed rich. "I will show you a valuable part," he said, "but give me time to set everything in order and make an inventory." After 3 days, he gathered a number of blind, lame, maimed, leprous, orphaned, and widowed persons and put them in rows. When the prefect arrived, Lawrence simply said, These are the treasures of the church. After Lawrence had said this, he was arrested and sent straight away to his execution, suffering on the burning coals of a gridiron. St. Lawrence was a great model for how the church looks at wealth today. This radical view that Lawrence had is still radical in the world today. Recognizing the worth of God's people, from the poor and the lame to those with the most power, is hard to do. From the 200s to the 2000s, little has changed. We seem to be only concerned with ourselves and our security. If sacrificing our own needs is at stake, we have often left the poor to suffer. That is not the calling that Jesus has placed before his followers, and does not show the one that St. Lawrence had died for. There's something in this radical change perspective which Jesus demonstrated during his life's ministry. He met with tax collectors, prostitutes, and the poor. He called the ordinary and the flawed to be his apostles. Jesus set up a radical change of self-denial and unconditional love for all people, which we are called to follow. And the church is catching on. The question is, are we? The Catholic Church has become less focused on our own needs and has turned her hands outwards. There's a recognition that the wealth of the church has nothing to do with paper bills. Rather, it has to do all about the people who Jesus Christ called us to serve and love. The church seems to be gaining a greater perspective. Eagleton referred to this change as a revolution. In one sense, the need for revolution is plain realism. No enlightened, moderately intelligent observer could survey the state of the planet and conclude that it could not be put to rights without a thoroughgoing transformation. The leaders of the church and her laity have recognized the needs of the world at large. This change became prevalent in the church with the changes made to the doctrine during the Vatican II. Christopher Baglow, a theology professor at Notre Dame, commented about these changes, clarifying that it wasn't that the church was committed to human dignity before Vatican II. He said it is with Vatican II the church began to look closely at the ways with which the modern thinkers need to promote human dignity, and showed how they and the Gospels are complementary. Nevertheless, the misconstrued preconceptions about how the church uses money, stemming from her past indulgences, the church has difficulty being seen in a good light, even today. What we need is proof. Living in a society dependent on knowing the truth and having empirical evidence for the existence of anything, proof could be convincing demonstration of this change. While there is no one book that documents each use of the church's money, there are a multitude of organizations and financial statements which can give us a good picture. In my paper, I looked at the Catholic Relief Services, financial statements of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the Holy See Vatican. So in the 2010 annual financial statement for the CRS, or Catholic Relief Services, we can see where the money is coming from and where it is going. Okay, I thought I had it there, but it's fine. So the revenue collected from private and public spheres totaled $918,950, while the expenses for all the program services totaled $823,045. So about 90%, I'll do that math for you, about 90% of these funds collected from parishes, public grants, all go directly to the services to the poor. And I bet a lot of people didn't know that. Another interesting point, which comes from this financial summary, is that the money is going to a variety of needs around the world, including HIV and AIDS, emergency programs, agriculture, health, education, and welfare programs, peace and justice, and small enterprises. It would seem that CRS is actually trying to develop an all-around better society for those in difficult situations. They may be meeting basic needs in one area, and then offering funds and education to help develop programs and continue this aid in areas that cannot remain. The Catholic Church is seeking to serve those the Lord has declared as his beloved. When there is deprivation around us, I am glad to know the Church is not remaining ignorant. The economic affairs of the Holy See have similar results. Even with an increase in employment by a little almost at 3,000 people in 2010, the Vatican financial statements have shown a surplus of about 9 million euros for the given year. While the incoming donations seem to be in a decrease, the Vatican also seems to decrease its spending in an effective manner. The extra money, mainly coming from donations from the Institute on the Works of Religion, is said to go to the activities of the Holy Father. While this statement is a little vague, I cannot help but have faith in the Church and her ways and see that it is going to the aid and the assistance of the beloved children throughout the world. So the Catholic Church seems to be doing well. Yet this bad reputation does not seem to go away. When I think about her past, I am reminded of Eagleton's emphasis on recognizing our failures. It is in our failures that we see a need for this radical change. The Church has seen her failures and is responding with radical change. My question is then, how can we change these misconstrued views of the Church? Maybe we should rip down the gold, start anew. Maybe we should be like those crazy preachers and proclaim a message of change. Maybe we should make flashing signs outside each individual parish with our financial statements. To me, none of these seem like a good option. If there's anything I've learned over the years, it is that we cannot change people, they need to change themselves. The Catholic Church does have a past, but because she has not chosen to be ignorant, I am encouraged by the direction that she is moving forward. I just pray we would continue to walk in the light of God's grace and seek after that radical transformation, knowing of the inevitability of our failure. The Catholic Church is not going to always be successful in her mission, but that does not mean that we should not give up trying and living as Jesus calls it. The people of the Church are her worth, and as that view, I believe things will change. It may just take time, but I am willing to wait.
God placed Adam in the garden. It was a perfect habitat. Man was placed over all of creation to be a caretaker, but sin corrupted the perfect balance, which was to be that creation would benefit man and man would benefit creation. The good news is that Jesus entered time to dwell among us and speak to us in parables so that we could understand something about the economy of creation. So let's give Jesus the final word. The thief does not come except to steal and kill and to destroy. I have come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for his sheep.